The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's new report webinar series. This webinar series features presentations by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. It also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is the Director of AUSA's Education and Programs Department, Nzinga Curry. Good afternoon and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our nation. Joining us today is Colonel L. Scott Lingamfelter, U.S. Army retired, and author of Yanks and Blue Berets, American UN Peacekeeper in the Middle East. For those joining us online today, please take advantage of having Colonel Retired Lingamfelter here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as possible. You can also find the full bio for Colonel Retired Lingamfelter and our moderator, Mr. Jerry O'Keefe, in the Handouts tab. As stated, the moderator for today's discussion is Mr. Jerry O'Keefe, who is an AUSA Senior Fellow and has 37 years of combined service as an Army officer and Department of the Army Civilian, SCS. His last job in the Army was as Administrative Assistant to the Secretary of the Army. In that role, he was a principal official of headquarters for the Department of the Army and served as the Senior Career Civilian and Senior Executive in the Department of the Army, overseeing a midriff of programs and functions in the Army and in the Pentagon. Mr. O'Keefe is currently the Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of the Civilian Marksmanship Program. Mr. O'Keefe, I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's always great to be here with the AUSA team and to support the Army. And I'd also like to welcome all of our online audience as well, and we certainly look forward to your questions. And we've got a great program here today. It's a great book. It's very topical and timely, especially given world events. So again, we really look forward to your questions. So let me introduce Scott, and then we'll get after it. Colonel Retired Scott Lingamfelter began his 28-year military career as a field artilleryman. He served as a frontline military observer in the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in Syria, Israel, and southern Lebanon. He also served after his retirement in the Virginia House of Delegates from 2002 to 2018. So thank you for your long service there as well. He's a regular contributor to the Washington Times. Additionally, Scott also wrote another book, in addition to the one we're going to talk about today, Desert Redleg, Artillery Warfare in the First Gulf War. And recently, Scott was inducted into the Field Artillery Hall of Fame, which is an amazing honor. So Scott, congratulations on that. And again, it's great to have you here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. First, let me thank both Joe Craig and the director of the AUSA book program and my publisher, University Press of Kentucky. They were great partners in getting this book done. I've had a very rewarding career as a soldier and a legislator, but as you can see, age does catch up with you. But my personal favorite pastime is, in addition to writing books, is being a granddad, because grandchildren are the dessert of life. So turning to the slides on why this book. First, surprisingly, many people are unaware of the role of American military officers and the role they played in the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization since the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948. Their experience and the stories of many of the United Nations military observers, or UNMOs, have received scant treatment in military literature. Yet the lessons that we learned are very important, including the dynamics, the inherent danger, and the importance of professionalism and level-headedness in the face of danger, particularly when you consider that UNSO military observers were unarmed in what was a de facto combat zone. Finally, there is much to consider from our experience and the adventures to inform peacekeeping opportunities today. So what about my sources? Here are some of the sources I used to write the book, including diaries, personal notes, US and UN documents and reports. But the most important source was the direct testimony of 18 UNMOs across the 4 US services, as well as international colleagues. Nowhere else will you find their firsthand accounts. And the response I received, interestingly, as I interviewed them was, wow, we've been waiting a very long time for someone to write this book. So a little bit about the US and UN history. Interestingly, senior US Marines had led UNSO in the early years, and Americans held important roles as the chief of operations and the chief of Observer Group Lebanon, the most renowned of our observer group activities in the region. The performance and the prominence of US officers in UNSO added to the credibility of the 36 of us who served with 257 other unarmed observers from 17 countries. Now, concerning the contribution of nations to UNSO in 1981, when I arrived, as you can see, we had a very diverse assembly, 293 observers, including 36 Russians who were restricted to service in Syria and Egypt, since other nations in the UNSO area at the time didn't have amicable relationships with the USSR. Sweden, a non-NATO country at the time, also had 36 officers in UNSO. Now, concerning peacekeepers and peace enforcers, it's important to know that there are different flavors, if you will, of peace operations, that of peacekeeping and that of peace enforcement. UNSO did the former, the others did the latter. In the UN Charter, there are 2 types of peacekeeping arrangements, the Chapter 6 Pacific Settlements of Dispute and the Chapter 7 Threats to the Breach of Peace and Aggression. The former suits peacekeeping. The latter tends to be more the configuration for peace enforcement. Whichever chapter is chosen, however, to configure a peace operation, it is vitally important to get the configuration, the mandate, the mission support, and those items correct from the beginning. But importantly, you must secure buy-in from the parties to the conflict. Frankly, if you don't have a force that is well trained and competent and that buy-in, things are not going to go well. Now, the major players that we had in 1981, there were 3 UN organizations, peace organizations in the Levant at the time. There was, of course, UNSO, organized under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter and composed of unarmed peacekeepers like myself and my colleagues. There was the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, situated in the Golan Heights, to keep peace between Israelis and Syrians. There were 1,280 troops in that organization who were armed, and 66 from UNSO who were unarmed. Yet it also was organized under Chapter 6, not the Chapter 7 enforcement provisions. However, the U.S. and Russians had a presence in UNDOF, and we were stationed in Damascus more or less to give credibility and to signal superpower support for that particular UN operation. And there was, of course, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, another armed peacekeeping effort of 5,931 troops that was organized again under Chapter 6, and 88 UNSO observers, 25% of whom were Americans. And that, again, was under Chapter 6. Why they were all organized under Chapter 6, I think, reveals an interesting point. The UN's hesitation to avoid Chapter 7 peace enforcement requirements, even when it might have been wiser to have that sort of configuration. Now, concerning the area of operations that we had, here's a map of our UNSO deployments around the region. The area of operations ran from Beirut in the north to Cairo, Egypt in the west, to Amman, Jordan in the east, to Damascus, Syria in the northeast, and Jerusalem in the central region. We also were quite spread out, but UNSO did a pretty good job of keeping the players focused. Most of the American military observers were in southern Lebanon. In 1978, prior to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon that year, we and our international partners occupied 5 fixed observation posts north of the Israeli border inside Lebanon. However, with the addition of UNIFIL, you can see in the next slide in 1978, after the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, UNIFIL was formed. Mm-hmm. And the battalions highlighted here were armed. Note that the area to the left, the Tyr pocket, it was occupied by the Palestine Liberation Organization, while the area running along the southern border, labeled DFF Enclave, was occupied by a breakaway Christian Lebanese army militia group that was allied with the Israelis. Remarkably, the UN condoned this. Therefore, UNIFIL didn't have effective control of the territory they were mandated to occupy. And since the UN acquiesced at this from the beginning, the combatants refused to surrender essential territory to UNIFIL. Now, concerning UNSO's ops and mobile teams, on occasion, we had to rein in our enthusiasm. I'm sorry, I just flip my slide here. As you can see from that slide, we had not only our OPs, but we had mobile teams that were also very much engaged in peace operations. Specifically, they helped resolve disputes when they came up. And all of us, unarmed fellows, participated both in those OPs as well as the mobile teams. Fascinating experience. Next slide, please. Now, turning to the role of the role and influence of American officers, we were a very qualified group of people. We were professionals. We were trained as combat officers, but we also had an experience, as I did, as being a foreign area officer, which was very, very useful. And the U.S. also had tremendous influence because we were a power player in the United Nations. We contributed significantly monetarily, and we were a diplomatic player among all the parties. Moreover, we had a formidable presence in the Mediterranean. In the event that things soured and went badly, the UN knew that we had forces throughout the region who could help resolve situations as they cropped up. Next slide, please. Now, sometimes our warrior can-do attitude rubbed other nationalities wrong. On occasion, we had to rein in our enthusiasm to work amicably with nationalities not given to our elan. It would have helped if we'd had a better diplomatic awareness before we showed up on the ground in the first place. Our UN training was very thin, very little on peacekeeping and conflict resolution, although they taught us what to do in the event the combatants were to steal our property. We were told to acquiesce. Our best training was passed down to us by other experienced observers, so we learned episodically in that regard. Concerning our experience, discovery learning best characterizes our experience in UNSO with little formal training, but what we did learn was nonetheless valuable. First, we had the opportunity to learn from other nationalities beyond those we traditionally had in NATO and in the Far East. Second, there was much to learn about the Arab-Israeli conflict and culture. But the eye-opener was learning episodically how to deal with the parties to the conflict in reporting violations, resolving disputes, negotiating hostage releases, and dealing with the deadly hostile fire that surrounded us all of the time. On our environment, I think it's fair to say that in general, the Levant was relatively sedate in 1991, except for southern Lebanon, which I referred to as the Wild West without a good saloon. As I wrote in Yanks, ceasefires in Lebanon are no more than fragile periods of attenuated violence. Indeed, the nature of conflict throughout the region, and particularly in Lebanon, was that of a dysfunctional family. And understanding that conflict was not made easier by exhibiting what I termed an intolerance to ambiguity, which is a tendency to reduce complex issues to a simple common denominator, to uncomplicate something and make it digestible, when in fact it is very complex at multiple levels. In reality, the complexity of Middle East conflict required that we rely on our acquired training, good judgment, and wits. So what about that Wild West without a good saloon? Here are some pictures. On the bottom left, you will see a wounded Irish UNIFIL soldier being evacuated in April 1980 by U.S. Army Major Harry Klein wearing the sunglasses. The upper right was taken by then Marine Captain Mike Fallon in March of 1978 of Israelis destroying a PLO position in southern Lebanon. In the center is U.S. Army Major Charlie Bauman, later a general officer, inspecting shelling damage to the UN headquarters in Nakura, Lebanon in April of 1980. The upper right is a bullet-riddled UNSO vehicle, and the lower left is Mike Fallon with a PLO soldier, merely a child. So, being an unarmed observer is a dangerous business. In southern Lebanon, we UNSO observers carried no weapons. All that was in our holster was just hard work, resourcefulness, patience, and decisiveness. The UN had the weapons. That is, the UNIFIL people had the weapons. All we had was a Blue Beret and our whips, the former useless in deflecting bullets, the latter vital in avoiding them. Concerning the upside of our service was found in learning from other nationalities, the complexities of peacekeeping, and the value of doing peacekeeping. That included the importance of impartiality, professionalism, and learning from others, teaching others, since we didn't know everything, but guess what? They didn't know everything either. And of course, building future military relationships. The downside came from the inherent dangers that we faced. Moreover, you had to be seen as trustworthy by the combatants. Sometimes they would tell us a lie that they represented as true and confidential to see if we would share it with others. If the lie came back to them, they would know that they couldn't trust us. If it didn't, they would trust us. As U.S. Marine Lenny Supko was fond of saying, you must assume at some point that everybody will lie to you, and that could endanger your life. Finally, if force contributors view peacekeeping as a one-off mission, the combatants will immediately exploit that to undermine the entire peace operation. So what are the lessons of peacekeeping? First, here are some important things to consider. Don't fall into the intolerance of ambiguity. Nothing is simple. The combatants must have buy-in to a peacekeeping operation or peace will be elusive. You must have a strong and enforceable mandate. There have to be consequences for violations of the peace. For armed peacekeepers, you have to have clear rules of engagement, particularly for deadly force. Peacekeeping training for both peacekeepers and peace enforcers is vital. Peace operations require detailed planning, just like wartime operations. And UNIFIL was horribly organized. And you must have competent personnel in units. Peacekeepers, as I like to say, cannot be placeholders. So what's the future of peacekeeping? The future of peacekeeping, particularly in Ukraine and Gaza. We have many lessons learned from past peace operations And we always go forward best, I like to say, when we go back first. And correctly configuring peacekeeping is essential, either under UN rules or under non-UN coalition arrangements. Finally, will the combatants agree to honor the peacekeeping structure? If not, the danger is profound. And so some final thoughts on peacekeeping. Finally, we as a nation need to think about the value of peacekeeping going forward. Particularly, we ought to consider what President Harry Truman had to say, and said it very well here. And as I've concluded in Yanks, we were indeed sentinels of peace, and did so despite the cynical view that some had of peacekeeping. Personally, I believe we were blessed to be peacekeepers in our time, and so did the Nobel Committee, because they awarded us the Peace Prize in 1988. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I mean, it's the book is extraordinary. Obviously, the complexities in the region that existed then and still exist now, the diplomatic and political complexities, historical complexities, geographic complexities, all in a region where you have these warring parties is just pretty extraordinary. And then to put a UN structure on top of that and expect it to work is just incredibly difficult. So thank you for your comments. I would like to remind everybody that's online that you can send in questions. We have a couple come in, but to make this whole hour work best, we want to hear from you and have your questions. But let me kind of start out at the beginning. So how did you, or how does at the time, how did a typical combat arms officer get selected to become a UN military observer or to serve in a peacekeeping role? And then if you could also, once you were selected, and you mentioned a little bit about the training or lack thereof, can you talk about what you did receive, maybe in a little more detail, or how other countries did it with their formations or individuals, and what can we learn from that?
Well, first of all, the last thing I thought I would ever do as an artilleryman is be a peacekeeper in the Middle East. And in fact, when I went to graduate school to get my degree in comparative governments of the Middle East, my focus was actually on Iran. That was my primary area of study. And so I was actually on orders to go to Tehran in 1979, but Iran changed management. And when Iran changed management, my personnel assignment fellow said, I don't think we're going to send you to that embassy after all, since it's being held, since the hostages are being held there. And they sent me to UNSO for my utilization. Because again, I had studied comparative governments of the Middle East, so I was certainly knowledgeable enough to understand the sort of Arab-Israeli issues that were going on at the time, and so I was a fit to do that. So my training for UNSO was largely academic. There really was no stateside training. I mean, we had an orientation before we went over, but there was no formal peacekeeping training. What do you do in situations to de-escalate a very, very complex situation, or negotiate for a hostage release of some family member who's been taken by an armed element? What do you do? Very little training at all in that respect. And on top of that, the UN did not have a lot of good training. I mean, we learned how to prepare ourselves to go pull duty on an OP, to work the generators, to drive the vehicles, but very little on conflict resolution. It's interesting. There were countries, however, I think, that spent some time doing this. Most of them were the Scandinavian contributors, the Finns, the Norwegians, and the Swedes. I think they spent a fair amount of time on this. I know the Canadians have been involved in peacekeeping for many years, and I'm pretty sure they had a pretty good Canadian-based approach as well, as did the Irish, who had participated quite a bit. The Dutch had participated quite a bit, and the French as well. With the United States, we just didn't have a lot of training that would blew you up, so to speak, for get you ready for duty in UNSO.
Yeah. So You talked some about your experience being an unarmed military observer, and honestly, I didn't realize that was the case until I read the book. I assumed that all of those folks had to be armed, given the nature of the assignment. And so, can you talk a little bit more about the challenges there being an unarmed military observer, especially with everyone around you, the IDF, their proxies, the DFF, obviously the Palestinian Liberation Authority, and even UNIFIL, and I'll get all these acronyms right, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, all the battalions that you showed, they're all armed. You're the only guys not armed. Can you talk more about the challenges?
Well, UNSO, the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, had been an unarmed organization since its founding in 1948. So that was, I think, the basis for maintaining that force as unarmed. And why was it unarmed? I think it was unarmed primarily for the purposes to make clear that UNSO observers were there to resolve disputes, not fight wars or take sides with either one of the combatants, either Arab or Israeli. And so that tradition, I think, was maintained over many decades, and it was that way when I got there. Interestingly, I do believe that the fact that we were unarmed on occasion was beneficial to our credibility because we were not seen as a threat. The biggest so-called threat that we represented is we called the balls and strikes. We would report violations. We would report breaches of the peace fairly, just the balls and just the strikes. And sometimes that would make one side angry at us and the other side not angry at us. Mm-hmm. And so they would try to manipulate us in that regard. But being unarmed actually, I think, added to our credibility in terms of being able to sit people down, drink a little tea, and work through a particular conflict to get people to settle down. We were there to, our weapon was our ability to focus on a solution as opposed to carrying a weapon. So I think that was probably the right thing to do, although there were times when I wondered, when I was having a gun waved in my face, if I wouldn't feel a little better having one for myself. But I think it actually accrued to our benefit.
Certainly some precarious situations for sure that you describe in the book. We are getting some questions in, so for the group out there online, thank you. And so let's go to a couple of those now. So the first one is interesting. So you showed the composition of the military observers in all the different countries, and it wasn't evenly distributed. And so how was that balance or imbalance selected, and did that have an impact on the operations, and how were the leaders selected?
Well, those are really great questions. As far as the number of UNMOs, if you will, that different nations would contribute to UNSO, that was pretty much up to the contributing nation. They weren't levied by the UN to come in these particular numbers. Countries just offered up what they felt they should offer up as far as the numbers in UNSO. As far as the quality of the officers that came in, they were generally out of two groups. They were regular officers like myself, and you certainly had that with a lot of the NATO countries. You had people who were professional soldiers, the French, for example, the Canadians, the Australians. Some countries, however, leveraged their reserve forces to send out. And they would come out to pull a tour of duty for a year and then go back to being a baker or candlestick maker or whatever it was that they did in their civilian lives. The professionals tended to be pretty much hard chargers. They would do things as they were trained as professional soldiers to do. The reservists a little more laid back, but still committed to the mission of peacekeeping, and interesting people too, because they were civilians. I mean, you had the opportunity to learn something about them as well. The leaders that the United States provided, I thought were very good. I thought that my colleagues in the Army and the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Air Force were all very, very good officers and quality people. And it showed up because often American officers took the lead, along with others like the Canadians and the Australians who would, get their hands around a problem and try to craft a solution and so on and so forth. And the other countries would certainly participate in that, some more than others. But generally speaking, I think that the leaders were sound and did very, very good work. The higher ups, General Erskine, who was the chief of staff of UNSO when I got there, had actually been the first commander of UNIFIL, and he was from Ghana and was a very, very well educated in British schools. So he was a very competent military officer, and his staff around him as well were quite good. So I think the leadership in UNSO was excellent, frankly speaking.
Great. Kind of leads to kind of the next question. Joint combined UN operations, command and control can be very complex. Typically there are, multiple chains up the chain of command. And so how did that work for you as a U.S. Army officer assigned to the UN? Obviously you had UN reporting duties. Did you also have a U.S. side that you reported to?
Well, that is also a very, very good question. There were certainly things that we had to attend to that were U.S. Army or U.S. Marine Corps or U.S. officer intensive issues, whether it was, going about the normal administrative things. I mean, everybody continued to get their evaluation reports. You had other administrative things that had to happen. There were occasions when the senior military observer would bring us in and give us some teaching and coaching on things that he thought we needed teaching and coaching on. But generally speaking, I did not have a lot of insight into the whole combined arms approach with respect to UNSO. I mean, I was a captain at the time, so I spent most of my time doing what other people told me to do. But I will say that U.S. officers tended to be, the operations officers, the people that were called upon to put together complex operations, and we accounted of ourselves well in that regard.
Great, thank you. So obviously, for the next question, I mean, the U.S. and Israel during your time and today, still very strong allies, important allies. Can you talk about, any preconceived notions you may have had going in terms of your relationships with the parties on the ground, both the Israelis and then the Palestinians or the Arabs on the other side?
Well, from the American point of view, no one should be surprised. I mean, most of the American officers who went over were fairly friendly towards Israel. I mean, our press here in the United States was friendly toward Israel. We certainly had a tradition of supporting Israel that goes back to President Truman's recognition of the State of Israel in 1948. So there was a long legacy of support for Israel. Of course, Israel, there was a great deal of sympathy in the United States from the 1967 war, from the 1973 war. So when I arrived in UNSO in 1981, I found many Americans were postured with a positive view of Israel when we got there. But when you get there and you see both sides of the situation, your perspective does change. And you do learn that it's not just a one-sided equation. The Israeli people were very nice to us. The Arab people were very nice to us in the UN. However, the Israeli Defense Forces were a little cold. They were a little standoffish. They sort of looked at U.S. contingent and wondered, why are you guys here with the UN? We don't trust the UN. Why are you here participating in this whole operation? And of course, being professionals as we were, we said, well, we're here to call the balls and strikes. We're here to be the honest broker, to ensure that everybody is treated fairly, to ensure that violations of the truce are fairly reported and accurately reported, as well as dealing with things that flare up between both sides. There's a risk in that. When combatants are at each other and you're calling the balls and strikes, sometimes one side feels that you're more favoring the other and vice versa. And so there's some tension that gets involved there. The Israelis were particularly aggressive in guarding their own interest by interdicting Palestinian elements in southern Lebanon to protect their own people back at home. And because they were fairly aggressive in this regard, they frequently were the ones who were violating the conditions of the ceasefires. But they were not alone in that. The Palestinians, the PLO, were also, in all their little armed element groups, were always out there making trouble in one form or another. So we had it coming from both sides. But the Israelis, having a very close relationship with the United States, kind of looked at the U.S. officers and wondering, why have you gone over to the dark side? I mean, that was sort of the view that they had. That said, many of us did our level best to play it straight down the middle and to call it as we see it. That was our job. That was our fundamental professional responsibility. And I think we did that well.
Great, thank you. So if you were assigned to the UN Truce Supervision Organization today and had to think about, and of course no one knows what's going to happen in Gaza here at the end of this conflict, but if you were there today and had to think about possible day after scenarios and a peacekeeping model for Gaza, do you have any thoughts on that or any suggestions?
Well, get it right. That's the first suggestion.
Well, obviously, your lessons learned that you showed on the chart was certainly a framework for folks to think about as they do that.
Well, I think that when you look at Gaza, and we don't know, how that's going to work out. I think there's a lot of fighting ahead, quite frankly. I don't think that that's going to end anytime too soon. But at some point, you'll be at a logical place where a peace arrangement of some sort will come into play. Whether or not the UN can take a lead on that in Gaza is a very much an open question. The UN has quite frankly been hesitant and late to condemn Hamas for their activities there. And so their credibility is somewhat in question. And on top of that, the Israelis have not been particularly supportive of the UN in their peacekeeping operations because they frankly don't think they've done a very good job at it. That they believe that the IDF is better postured to guard their interests than the UN. And there's some truth to that. And I write about that in the book. There's some truth to their concern. So I think for Gaza, we may be better looking at some sort of allied coalition arrangement that creates some protectorate at some point, bring the right players in to do that. There may be a role for UNSO's unarmed observers in that respect, but I do not see the UN taking the lead on Gaza. I don't think the Israelis would stand for it, frankly, at this point. And I think that probably countries like Canada, the United States, maybe Australia, possibly Sweden, and some of the Scandinavian countries, along with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, some of the local Arab powers as well, might be able to cobble together some sort of coalition arrangement that would pacify Gaza until some indigenous government can be identified. It can't be Hamas. Hamas is toast at this point. They're going to be pushed out of the picture. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is probably not a solution. They've been fairly feckless, if you want to know the truth of it. So I think this is going to have to be something that's original, but we have to bring in the right kind of coalition that will have the trustworthiness and the intent to try to truly pacify Gaza. That's going to be hard. I've said, a coalition, I've tried to make it sound like it can come together fairly quickly. It can't. Yeah. It's going to be a very complex arrangement. You didn't ask about Ukraine, but it's a completely different breed of cat. I mean, with the Russians involved, right. I think it may be tougher to come up with a peace arrangement and a peacekeeping arrangement in Ukraine than it is in Gaza, if you want to know the truth.
Yeah, I understand. And in the book, it was interesting how, and you alluded to it earlier, the Russian play in Damascus while we were up there, but but the Israelis wouldn't let the Russians participate in operations in other part of the area of operations.
You raise a good point though, because UNDOF, of the arrangements that we had there, UNSO being the unarmed peacekeeping observer force, UNIFIL being the armed quasi peace enforcement outfit in southern Lebanon, and UNDOF on the Golan Heights. UNDOF was actually a very successful operation. Henry Kissinger, the late Henry Kissinger, actually put UNDOF together. In fact, you could call it USDOF because there was so much influence of the United States. But he very wisely composed that, knowing full well that the Israelis and the Syrians were ready to disengage combat in the Golan Heights. Neither side had any interest in, continuing to kill each other in that respect. And putting that particular arrangement together was quite proactive, and Kissinger did great work at it. And the key to UNDOF is both the Israelis and the Syrians bought into it, and they didn't fight the system. They saw the benefit of that disengagement. It's not going to be a simple calculus in Gaza in that respect. And it certainly wasn't a simple calculus in southern Lebanon, particularly since the PLO refused to give up territory UNIFIL was supposed to have, and the Israelis therefore said, well, we're going to keep this buffer zone with our Christian militia buddies there. So that thing fell apart on day one because its mandate was never truly fulfilled, in my view.
Yeah, it is interesting you bring up Dr. Kissinger. Obviously, he recently passed away, and as you articulate, the pre-diplomatic work, or the diplomatic work done before UNDOF went in, that he led, with shuttle diplomacy and other things, was really central to setting the right conditions on the ground for the UN operation that followed.
And you have to wonder who those Kissingers are today. I've been doing some thinking about this because I'm thinking about writing something in the near future on this particular topic. But we have a great deal of talent in the United States. There are people who, the Dave Petraeuses of the world, you could turn to and say, how do we put something together here? So it's not that we don't have the talent to do that. I think we certainly have the talent to pull that together. The question is, do we have the will? And can we put something together that's rational and that will work? And we'll have the right coalition membership to communicate legitimacy so that peace is possible. That's the hard part.
Yeah, it is for sure. So another question from one of the folks online is to kind of compare and contrast the multinational force and observers in the Sinai with what you experienced, and is that a model that we should be looking at in the future, or are the conditions there just different? Because that's been fairly successful.
That's a very good question, and I think the MNF, that, as you know, just for viewers, remember the MNF came about as a function of the Camp David Accords. The UN organization that was in the Sinai before that was the UNEF, the United Nations Emergency Force 2. There was a 1 and a 2, one before the 67 war and one after the 67 war. But after the Camp David Accords were signed, it was agreed between Israel and Egypt that we would have a multinational force that would occupy zones in the Sinai as a way to encourage a confidence building measure, if you will, to ensure that we had neutral arbiters sitting in the Sinai, and we were going to observe the conditions of Camp David, the land for peace exchange, and so on and so forth. So I think the MNF has been a success story as well. In fact, if you look at UNDOF and you look at MNF and you put those two things side by side, you have a basis to say, okay, well, what should a peace arrangement look like? Because there are certainly aspects of both of those two different things, I think, that would be very beneficial. And again, I think we've got some very smart people in this country who could sort through that.
So would the Kosovo peacekeeping operation also fall into the same bucket? As you said, that's been going on.
There are definitely lessons learned from Kosovo as well. And they would certainly populate any logical approach to looking at a peace arrangement for Gaza, or for that matter for Ukraine. In fact, Kosovo may provide us with a little better database for Ukraine than, say, UNDOF or MNF would, for Ukraine. So, but I think Ukraine is a tough nut to crack because remember the Russians are on the Security Council of the UN.
That's right. Yeah.
So if you think it's going to be a UN operation, you're probably going to get a veto. If it's going to be a coalition one, is it going to be heavily NATO? Would that be acceptable to the Russians? Probably not. Who's left that you can pull in that would agree with the Russians? Their circle of friends are not very good these days. So that's a harder nut to crack.
Great. So I think we have time for just one last question. And so it's kind of one of those lessons learned questions. But I mean, obviously, peacekeeping or peace enforcement operations are often a consequence of post-combat operations. And so should that be part of our larger campaign? Should it be part of our formal planning process to build in that phase of kind of post-conflict operations?
It's a really good question. And what does our doctrine say about that? You should plan for success, right? That's what we teach everybody from the time they're little lieutenants. Plan for success. And so what is success in an operation? Well, in a wartime operation, certainly to achieve your wartime goals. But at some point, you also need to transition to hopefully a peaceful environment. And I think it would be good for, certainly at the combatant commander level, to think about, okay, what's next? To be somewhat proactive and ask the question, what should a peace arrangement look like? Not a negotiated peace, but what role would, say, a military organization have in helping to establish a peace arrangement where, it's interesting, you've got peacekeeping, you have peace enforcing, but you also have this thing called peacemaking. And that's the environment in which you try to build trust among the players. And I think that we do have some doctrine on that with respect to how we pacify countries. I think very good work done by General Petraeus and others as they pull together that aspect of doctrine. And I think that that's a good start point for us to look at and say, okay, what are the tenets? What are the things we should be thinking about post-kinetic so that we are postured to help create a success story where once there was violence and war.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. Again, thank you for joining us today. The book is wonderful. And before I turn it back over to Ms. Curry, do you have any final comments?
Well, if people want to get the book, they can get it from the University Press of Kentucky. My publisher would be very happy for me to say that because they would love to sell you books, but you can get it on Amazon as well. If you want an autographed copy, you can go to my website, which is copybookwarrior.com. One word, copybookwarrior.com, and I'll sign a book for you and send it to you. But it's available on the internet anywhere. And the last thing I would say, quite frankly, is that peace is worth it. I'm a warrior. I was trained to be a warrior. But I think if you talk to any warrior, we will all agree that peace is better than war. And sometimes you have to fight those wars. But it's good to learn the lessons from the past, Kosovo, UNSO, other things, to help populate our ideas for shaping peace operations. And so good luck with Ukraine and real good luck with Gaza. But thank you for inviting me.
Great. Scott, thank you very much.
You bet.
Ms. Curry, back over to you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for such a wonderful discussion. And I also want to note that AUSA, we are offering the book for sale as well. So you can click on the pop-up and just quickly purchase it through AUSA, and you will also get a signed copy. I also want to share, before we depart, about a few upcoming events. So we will host a coffee series on the 13th of December, featuring General James Rainey, Commander General of the U.S. Army Futures Command. And then next year, it'll be here right before we know it, AUSA will host a coffee series, another coffee series, featuring General Randy George, Chief of Staff of the Army, on 6 February. The very next day, we will host a Hot Topics on 7 February, focusing on contested logistics. And then later, on the 21st of February, We will host another coffee series featuring the SMA of the Army, Sergeant Major of the Army Michael Weimer. And we have several other things taking place in March and throughout the year of 2024. So I hope that you will be able to take part in those wonderful events. For more information, go to our events page at ausa.org/meetings. And then finally, I want to thank all of you who support us with your membership. Membership matters. You help us support the Army. So thank you for attending and have a wonderful day.